More on this, we're joined by Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter for The Hill. Mychael, good afternoon. You know, we've been following the disruptions there in that Senate aid hearing. A new bill from House Republicans has set the stage for a fight over support for Israel. The measure calls for $14 billion in emergency aid to Israel to be paid for by cutting IRS funding. This is the new Speaker's first big legislative move. What are the chances of this bill actually passing, Mychael?
Hey, Nick, look, right now, the bill's chances of passing, at least in the House for once, for starters, is up in the air. And there are two key issues here. You mentioned the first one, the fact that there are pay-fors included in this piece of legislation. So traditionally, emergency funding doesn't include these offsets, doesn't include these pay-fors. But as you mentioned, this includes $14.3 billion in cuts to IRS funding. And that has sparked some concern among Democrats. Some folks, voicing, speaking out against the fact that there are pay-fors included in this supplemental funding. Some saying that it shows that it's not really emergency funding if Republicans are trying to offset it with different funding. So we'll have to see if that turns off Democratic opposition when it ultimately comes to the floor. The second issue here is the lack of Ukraine funding, or rather the absence of Ukraine funding in this piece of legislation. Democrats and some Republicans also have been very adamant that they want to move Ukraine funding and Israel funding at the same time in the same package. There's some concern that Ukraine funding couldn't actually make it over the finish line as a standalone bill because of this growing skepticism within the Republican Party about sending increased funds to Kyiv. So those are two key issues that Democrats and some Republicans, specifically about not pairing Ukraine aid and Israel aid, have with this piece of legislation that are really going to play into his chances of being able to pass on the floor later this week.
Mychael, this is a big test, without question, for Johnson in his new role as Speaker. What will you be looking for as this bill faces a vote, and perhaps as soon as literally this week?
Yeah, look, Mike Johnson is going to want unanimous Republican support on this piece of legislation. And there's been some reporting that Congressman Tom Massey, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene are not in favor of this piece of legislation, that they plan to vote against it. Speaker Johnson did an interview with Fox News yesterday where he said that he's already made outreach to Tom Massey to talk about this bill with him, try to cajole him to get on his side. So I'm going to be really interested in seeing how Mike Johnson, makes his way through these political and legislative landmines. We're talking about Ukraine aid, Israel aid, foreign aid. It's always a big conversation within Congress. So I'm curious to see how Mike Johnson navigates those conversations if he's able to get this piece of legislation over the finish line. As you mentioned, it's his first big legislative push as Speaker. And then after that, I want to see how he handles Ukraine aid, because he has said adamantly that Ukraine should not be left on the sidelines, that the U.S. needs to continue to aid and fund its ally. How he actually does that in the very fractious GOP conference, that's going to be fascinating to watch.
And Mychael, part of this funding for Ukraine, is my understanding, is also meant to resupply many of the munitions and weapons that we actually sent to Ukraine, correct, here in the United States?
Yeah, and this all right, that regardless of where the money goes, I mean, there have just been some Republicans who have flat out said they don't want to send additional money to Ukraine. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has really been one of the loudest voices in this camp, essentially saying that sending additional funding to Ukraine is a red line for her. She said that throughout several legislative pushes in recent months. A lot of Republicans are asking for accountability measures. They want to know exactly where this funding is going once it gets to Ukraine. Others are saying that they want to hear from the Biden administration a clear endgame to the war between Ukraine and Russia. How exactly are these funds being used, and how will this war eventually come to an end? Those are two concerns that Republicans have been voicing, including right now as we talk about the White House's supplemental request, which included roughly $60 billion in Ukraine aid. Some Republicans are voicing concerns.
And Mychael, I think that there are some on the far left who would also like to hear what the end game is from the Biden administration. Either way, it looks as though the administration has a lot more explaining to do. Mychael Schnell, thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.